Hello and welcome to Checkpoint on Campus. Jacob Brothers is here and Erica Sadora is there. But we are joined by a very beloved special guest. I believe he's in the running for most handsome person in esports. That's just a rumor that
Stop
I've heard. It is
it.
Adam Antor, the Director of Esports at Florida Southern College. Coach, it's been a long time. Thanks so much for
It
coming
has
on.
been far too long, but I'm avid listener of the show, and I'm
Stop it.
excited to be back. So thank you for having me.
Oh,
Stop it.
you
Now remind me,
flatter us so
how
much.
how long has it been since you took over Florida Southern College as
Oh,
a
I
director?
started on September 1st, so we're right about 5 or 6 months. So
Awesome.
Ooh.
Yeah, so that's been a couple months, and so a question that I always have for directors is, what's the major areas of growth that you've seen in your short amount of time already with the school?
yeah, so what's interesting about my position now is that I'm taking over a program that was already there, and I think with any coaching change, there's this period of students kind of feeling out where the coach wants to bring the program, and the coach trying to feel out how much change can I bring to the program without upsetting students too much. And I think that's kind of where me and the program are right now, is that we're taking this big ship that was going one direction and like slightly moving it towards a different direction, and in a direction that I feel is better for our program and our institution. But with that comes a little bit of pushback. So that's kind of what's interesting, no matter any coaching change, and seeing that battle kind of between the two, can be interesting. It can be difficult. I talked with a lot of coaches who take over programs or start new ones that have clubs on campus. And there's always this kind of battle between the students who kind of had their way of doing things, and then the new director or coach who has what they believe is a better direction to go in. And that's kind of what I'm dealing with right now. And it comes with a lot of excitement, and a lot of drama, I guess. But
Ooh.
yeah, no, it's really exciting. I love it, because that's when a program and students really grow and mature and learn about kind of new ideas, and that excites me. So.
Yeah. So on that note, of the teams that you do have, do you feel that they're all prepared for the upcoming season? How are all your teams
Ooh.
shaping up for all their various tournaments?
Good question. Our League of Legends team is looking really strong right now. We had a walk-on freshman come in, who just hit Challenger in November. So really excited about that. And a new student came in at semester, a master jungler. So we
Ooh.
kind of have this strong potential. But we're in the same partner conference as Converse University, which is a name that we've kind of all talked about. So it's going to be a tough one, but I'm really excited about that. Rocket League continues to be pretty competitive. They just started NACE. They're 1-1. They dropped a Game 5 overtime against Full Sail last night, which was a heartbreaker, but it was really exciting experience because they're right down the road from us. And then our Overwatch team is a work in progress. We're really focusing on player development this semester so that we can come back really strong in the fall. So all of our teams are in different places in their development, and I'm really excited to be a part of it.
So you talk about a little about talking about other with other coaches, and a little birdie told me you just came back from the Future of Education Technology conference.
I
Is that
did.
correct?
It
Ooh,
is correct. Yeah. It
could
was
you
a lot of
summarize your
fun.
experience? Yeah, and
Yeah,
your
it
level of
was
involvement there?
yeah, it was really cool. It's a massive conference. A lot of IT professionals from the high school level go to it. And I was asked to be a part of one of the esports panels. They had a whole series of presentations and panels related to esports, and it was really exciting to be a part of. But I also got to meet up with a couple of coaches that I know well, like Doc Haskell from Boise State and Joey Gariziak from Shenandoah. I mean, these guys are all stars. So I got to spend a lot of time with them, and Full Sail I got to see and tour, and their facility is just amazing. They were prepping to host a Madden kickoff event this past weekend, and they had it all. All the shiny things were out, and it was just a production like paradise. Like it was so cool. I can't speak enough to of what they're doing there. But yeah, it was just a great experience because you got to meet a lot of high schools that are looking at starting high school teams and answer a lot of their questions, and that's always really exciting to me. I know like the Orlando, Florida school district is 22 high schools, and they're starting esports this spring with 12 of their high schools. And that was just kind of a common theme, is just a lot of excitement at the high school level, and that excited me.
Yeah, that's awesome. Speaking of high school, Coach, I've told you this before, and I'll tell you again. One of my favorite things about you is that you're a take man. You're a hot take man, and we love hot takes. And
Absolutely.
one thing that's been developing in the scholastic scene is the whole play versus fiasco.
It
Uh,
has.
so I guess the opening question to that conversation is: could you explain that situation as if I were five of like what's been going on in the past couple weeks?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a couple of years in the making. Playversus entered the scene as a for-profit esports tournament organizer in the high school space, and they got a lot of funding, a lot of money, and they started making relationships with developers, which led to the ability to create exclusive partnerships with those developers. And basically, they charge schools and students for those schools and students to compete in their leagues, and now they own the exclusive rights to some pretty big game titles. Overwatch and Hearthstone are the latest on that list. Super Smash Brothers is a name they say they have exclusive rights to, as well as League of Legends. And now they are threatening legal action to some of the state nonprofits that have been running tournaments and leagues for the high schools in their area. Um, and that kind of came to a head, or at least moved in that direction a little bit more a couple weeks ago when emails went out to those other high school tournament organizers and leagues, telling them that they need to halt all competition in those game titles. And from me personally, what gets me is because is the fact that a lot of these nonprofit state leagues are operating on the backs of volunteer teachers who see esports as an amazing opportunity for their students. And a lot of times they're not getting paid. They're doing it out of like their own free time and because it's so important to them. And I come from the high school scene. I started a high school team. I was on the board of the Michigan nonprofit league, and I know how frustrating this can be for students, for teachers, etc. And it's just something that I can't sit back and idly and not talk about going forward and in the present. I mean, it's just so important. I've talked to high school teams who just after their state leagues are shut down because of play versus and the threats that they make, they can't hold teams in those game titles anymore. So we've seen high schools just drop League of Legends out of nowhere because they can't field teams. So that obviously will affect the collegiate scene for years to come as those students graduate high school and aren't competing in those game titles. So it's really a massive problem that all of collegiate needs to be focused on and looking at and seeing how we can help out. And I think from my perspective, it seems like the developers just aren't aware that it's such a massive problem, or they frankly don't care. And that's where I also get pretty frustrated and emotional as well, because I talk with these developers too, and they just don't see the same level of problem as I do when it comes to the space. So um, yeah, it's been a wild couple of weeks when it comes to the high school scene and play versus, and my assumption is it's only going to get worse. And it's something that everyone should be keeping an eye out on. So um,
Yeah,
yeah.
Erica, you have a question?
I was just gonna say I really appreciate how like sympathetic and I'm more so empathetic towards the high school scene because as someone who started playing games in high school, I think it's really important for people to actually move away from I guess the business end of it and actually realize that these are students and it's really affecting their lives for something that they really wanted to play competitively in.
It is, yeah.
So thank you for like speaking out on it. I know Jacob, you had a question.
Yeah, I mean, my question really is so like, what is the primary solution to this? Because so is it not like, do we not completely know what PlayVersus has the rights or the exclusivity to run?
We don't, and we're kind of going
Okay.
off of what Playversus says, and then if the developers come back and say, yeah, that's true, like you can't. Nobody has seen an actual licensing agreement between Playversus and the developers. I'm not sure if that's just because it's not public information or what, but nobody has seen those agreements, so we don't know what's true and what's not. We're kind of going off of what the emails from Playversus say. Um, to this day, none of them, I believe, have been pressed legally past an email threat. But I'm assuming that could become a reality if these state nonprofits and some other actors in the high school space kind of ignore those emails. And that would be a really interesting story to follow, to see kind of what actually is on the table and what could happen in the court. Um, I think at this point in time, we just don't know. We're kind of trusting what we see, and that's that's a big question, and a concern. And a lot of these developers, when I ask them kind of what their thoughts are on this whole thing, if they do claim there is an exclusive deal with Playversus, they often push me towards the community guidelines that they allow for. And those community guidelines, as you guys might be aware, are very restrictive and require, like League of Legends, for example, you can run an event in League of Legends, but it has to be less than 16 teams and it has to be within a 2-week window. So that completely erases any possibility of having a league at a semester length or a state org from creating competition because they have more than 16 teams. So those community guidelines are often laughable in my opinion. And I go back to, I mean, why I got into the high school space to begin with when I started a high school team is because I still game with my high school buddies, and I wanted to create that same opportunity for students in my school. It had nothing to do with I'm going to make money off of these kids or these parents. I'm going to whatever it was. Like, it started as let's just create a community on campus. And then it was like, okay, let's play other communities on other campuses. And now it's evolved into a for-profit company trying to make some money off of our students and our schools. So really frustrating, to
Yeah.
say the
So
least.
absolutely. So I guess here's a question for me then. Is there a reality where play versus can exist while the nonprofit organizations also exist and everything just makes sense? I mean, would it be like Blizzard and Psyonix and those groups being like, okay, here's what they can do, here's what they can't do. Let's revisit our guidelines. Let's make things more welcoming. Is that just kind of a pipe dream, or would
I,
that really solve problems?
there's a possibility, but I just don't think the leadership of Playversus is willing to look at that as a possibility. I think there's a world where Playversus could host the national competition for high school, and they leave the state orgs alone, or the state orgs could feed into a national competition that Playversus runs. But if they continue to use the model from a business standpoint of charging students and charging schools, I don't think most of those state organizations are interested in a conversation about that. I think really at the cusp of the argument is Playversus charges kids to play video games in an organized way. And yes, Playversus will sit over where they are and say, no, we're not charging students, we're charging schools. But in my experience, in every high school coach that I've talked to, those schools aren't supporting esports, especially financially. So oftentimes, if a team wants to compete in those schools or in those leagues like Playversus, the students have to pay. And a lot of school districts I talk to have a significant population of low income students who get free or reduced lunches. And the idea of asking them to pay $65 per season to compete in Playversus is just a non-starter, and something that Playversus just seems to not have any grasp on or interest in talking about, and that's also frustrating.
Yeah, let's dive into the business organization a little bit because I had listened to your talk show, Esports Talk, and it was interesting because it was cheap in the beginning, and then the $65 per student thing happened. Can you walk me through that?
Yeah, so recently in the last couple of years, what they've done is approach high schools and said, "Hey, we'll let you compete in Playversus for 1 year for $1, and then after your trial period, we're going to go to full price." And sometimes those contracts that were signed said basically there's an auto renewal at the end of that 1 year, which is not how most of the high school scene works outside of esports. You don't just have an auto renewal, um, and that's the type of predatory behavior. I mean, when I was sold that idea, there was not a discussion of the auto renewal at the end of the year, or we're just going to invoice you the thousands of dollars your team is going to pay in year two. But there's this, they like to kind of shake on the end of the stick, if you will, that like, hey, we're letting all schools participate for $1 the first year. And that's kind of like the cable companies like to do the same, where it's like, hey, for the first 2 years, you've got a big deal. And then you get hit with like the twice the price. So yeah, that's what they're doing. I mean, I don't. I think it's really interesting talking to some high school coaches who say that the dollar wasn't even worth what they got out of competition. From my experience, the dollar was fine. When we played in Fortnite, like we had some players competing in it when I was coaching at the high school level, but it was nothing special that our nonprofit state league wasn't able to bring to the table. And that's the other thing is like, is the value really there for what they're charging? In my opinion, and other high school coaches' opinions, it's not. So,
Right. What are the, I guess, disparities of quality then if you're paying for something like what were you expecting versus what you got?
hmm, from my personal experience, since I've done a lot of national leagues, my expectations were probably met at the same level that I was expecting. But I mean, the CEO of Playversus came out with a letter last fall outlining that their forfeit rate was over 40 to 50%. So imagine paying $65 per student per season. So let's say League of Legends, you're paying 300 and some dollars for the fall season for your team to compete in, and half of your matches the other team doesn't even show up. Like, there's a massive problem there when my nonprofit state league was offering the same thing for free, and oftentimes the forfeit rate is much lower because you have personal relationships with the high school coaches at other schools in those leagues. And that is one piece of the value proposition. In my opinion, Playversus their website acts as the platform where tournament and the league runs through, and that platform just isn't that fantastic. I've used better ones. I've gotten free access to better ones. And then also like their adminning from a TO perspective just hasn't been that fantastic. I mean, if you're paying that much at the high school or the college level, to be honest, you expect a high level of adminning within your tournaments, and I just did not see that in my experience. Um, so those are kind of the pieces of the value proposition when you talk about charging for a league. You kind of expect some level of quality that I just don't think it's hitting.
Right.
So when we talk about quality, I really want to hone in on CLOL, and since that's coming up, it's a really big thing. But I do know that Riot is keeping their contract open with Playversus. Is that correct? I think I'm pretty
Um,
sure.
for the high school scene, question mark? Is that what you're asking about?
Yes.
So the high school scene, yeah, Riot's staying with Playversus for the foreseeable future at this point. They wouldn't tell me how long that contract is, but it seemed like Riot has decided Playversus there's their long-term partner, and they're working with Playversus to address feedback and concerns that come from the high school scene, which frankly is not what I see happening. But that's what they tell me. Um, yeah,
I do want to pick your brain further pick your brain on it.
yeah,
I would say
absolutely.
a lot of the times our collegiate players move from high school to the collegiate scene, but since Playversus is having such a big presence in the high school scene right now for League, do you think that's going to affect the ecosystem we have going on?
It absolutely will. I mean, like I said before, there's high schools that have just dropped League of Legends because they couldn't run it legally as a competition within their nonprofit state leagues. And because of that, there's a further lowering of the player population at the high school level, which makes recruiting a lot more difficult. And at a certain point, if there's not enough high school players coming into the college scene, teams are going to struggle getting 5 players, and you'll start seeing a drop in the amount of colleges supporting the game. And from my perspective, the high school scene is a really good sign as to what titles colleges are going to be fielding in the next 2, 3, 4 years, because that is the player base of which we have to field those game titles. So I would look to what is the high school scene playing to see what game titles we might be playing at the college level in the next couple of years. Um, and this whole play versus drama, especially with League of Legends, I think has really affected it already and will continue to affect it now that they're exclusive with the Blizzard Activision Blizzard titles. I kind of assume it's going to affect those titles very soon as well.
Yeah. Last question for me before we move off of Play Versus. Do you think that if Play Versus took more of a grassroots approach, I guess so, instead of bullying uh, competitors in their space, rather working with them, and dealing with the price aspect of their service, do you think that would resolve a lot of the play versus issues that we've seen in the present day?
I, Depending on what that means on the ground level, when you talk about running more grassroots, it could. I think at the end of the day, the biggest point of contention is this charging of students and schools. But even further than that, it's the going after the nonprofit leagues who are offering free competition and legally trying to strong arm them into not offering certain game titles. If they avoided the strong arming through the legal uh, thing or the legal pathway, you'd probably see a lot less anger towards Playversus, but you would still not like the entity as a whole if you're an educator. Um, but on the other side, if they stopped charging students and found a different way to monetize their product, I think you'd see a lot more positivity towards what they're doing and a lot more openness to using them. I think if you look at right now, NACE Star League is not charging schools to be a part of it, but through their sponsorships and partnerships, they're bringing in a significant amount of revenue that helps make the whole thing worth it. Could Playversus do that and monetize their playoff broadcast? Yes, they could. Is it a little bit more work than invoicing a school every 6 months? Yes, probably. But you'd find a lot more partners in the space through that, in my opinion, at the high school level, than just flat out charging schools and students.
Right. Well, time will tell as things develop. Hopefully, we see some of those things come into effect. But moving into a much more positive direction, final question from me. In the whole landscape of collegiate esports as a whole, I asked Doc when we talked to him last. I want to hear you, the other great mind in collegiate esports. What is the main development that you'd like to see happen? Like, on your list of like, here's how collegiate esports could grow and develop and be better. What is the top of that list and what you would love to see happen this year?
Oh gosh. For me, that's a lot of that's a lot. I think there's so much room for growth in collegiate in general, whether it's more schools getting involved, bigger schools getting involved. I think a bigger emphasis on career opportunities for students, I think, is a major opportunity. I think too many programs are focusing only on field your five or your games, compete in your games, and then shuffle your students across the stage as they graduate. Then creating real career opportunities for students to be successful post graduation. I think what Checkpoint XP on campus has done for students at UNLV, I think, is a fantastic example of this. You guys have developed some fantastic talents that can help post graduation, obviously, and that I think is something that most programs need to work better at. In their development, I think Boise does a fantastic job from a production standpoint on that, and I think most programs can learn from them, and look even further. Look at finding opportunities for students on your campus to work as analysts or social media, graphic designers, all the above. There are a plethora of companies hiring for these types of students right out of graduation, and I don't think students are as prepared as they could be with that. So hopefully, in the next year or two, those programs can look at those opportunities and build them.
Well, there you have it. Hopefully, thank you for the kind words, Coach. This has been great, as always. It's always an absolute pleasure. So we really appreciate you coming onto the show, and we wish you the absolute best in this upcoming year for your program.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Stop it. The pleasure is all ours.